Lawyers of Reddit. What's the worst way you've seen a person screw over someone else in court, whether it be criminal, civil, or divorce proceedings? I am being sparse on details here due to confidentiality. But I had a client who was accused of a very nasty sexual offense. He had an alibi. He was at work, where he was the boss. He had an employee who could absolutely vouch for his being there. I talked to the employee confirmed this. It gets closer to the trial, and around the time when I need to send in an alibi notice, which is advance notice to the Crown so that they can investigate the alibi and determine whether or not it's true. But I am being careful, so I call the employee up again. Turns out my client fired him in the interim. And so the employee quite candidly tells me, "Oh, yeah, he was definitely at work." But that's not what I'll say in court. Fuck that guy, he is going down. I did not call him as a witness, or filed the alibi notice. Still won the trial. But if I hadn't thought to call the guy, or if he'd been less candid, my client would have been fucked hard. Sex offender registry, jail time, the works, completely innocent, and GT. Still won the trial. But if I hadn't thought to call the guy, or if he'd been less candid, my client would have been fucked hard. Sex offender registry, jail time, the works, completely innocent. He's the boss and stupid enough to fire his alibi witness before the trial. Laughing face. From talking to the employee, I am guessing he sorely deserved the firing. That said, people accused of crimes may not be the brightest, but even the smart ones often make some dumb mistakes. I mean, a lot of people with child porn get caught because they take their computer in to get fixed and don't think, "Hey, I'm handing off evidence of very serious crimes to a random stranger." Well, not my story, but a prior boss's story. They had a drunk driver kills a car worth of people case at the time when they were a general practitioner. My boss was representing the family that got hit and wanted the college guy's drunk skin to be mounted on a wall. This was back before Facebook was commonly used in court proceedings and before tons of people realized that shit is too great for any attorney worth their weight in salt to pass up. So, the kid had managed to get the judge's sympathy during the first part of the hearing by saying he was sorry, haunted, never going to drink again, this was going to ruin his life, etc. The judge seemed to really be eating it up. Then comes my boss and immediately burns this kid's remorse to the ground by showing numerous Facebook statuses and photos of them binge drinking, partying, and even joking about driving drunk from the date of the accident up until a night ago. The kid looked like he was being forced to swallow hot coals and the judge was absolutely livid. Needless to say, the kid had to do way more than just apologize and be remorseful after that. And GT, needless to say, the kid had to do way more than just apologize and be remorseful after that. It goes better saying it though. How much did he got for killing 3 people? 10 years more. He got his phone taken away from him this year. More of a case of screwing himself over, but here goes. This was a case another prosecutor in my office had a few years back. 30-year-old defendant was charged with sexual assault of a child after he got his girlfriend's 14-year-old sister pregnant. She actually kept the baby, so the police just waited and got a paternity test. No surprise, defendant was the father. Defendant wanted probation, prosecutor refused to offer it. He decided to plead guilty and have a jury trial on punishment. Evidence mostly proceeded as expected. The victim testified to having consensual sex with the defendant, getting pregnant, etc. Paternity test introduced. Defendant took the stand. His version of events was that he snuck into victim's room at night, covered her mouth, and held her down while he forcibly had sex with her against her will. It seemed like his own lawyer had no idea. That's the story he settled on. The jury deliberated about 15 minutes before returning a verdict of 17 years. When interviewed by the attorneys afterwards, one of them said they decided on 17 years so the defendant would never forget the age of consent in Texas again. He chose to have a Texas jury, decide his sentencing after he got a 14-year-old girl pregnant. What an idiot. The real idiot thing was to tell them he forcibly raped her when she already testified to it being consensual. I'm currently representing a sweet old lady on a case. I'll be sparse in the details in case anyone figures out who I am, monsieur. Long story short, this lady's neighbor convinces her that her house is basically unsellable, that her house requires all sorts of repairs, the repairs to the house would bankrupt her, and that she should just sell the house to him. As he shows up at her house the next day with documents to sign, she has no idea what's going on, doesn't read anything and signs everything. When she finally sees a lawyer to close the deal, he says, "WTF, you can't do this. You see, the price of the transaction was about 36% of what the house is actually worth and there weren't any repairs that needed to be done that would justify the price." Not kidding, it was stuff like fixing a faucet in the bathroom, monsieur. Also, she didn't understand that she would have nowhere to live afterwards. Old lady thought she could just stay in the house until she died. To make matters worse, she's living off a modest pension and the other side is suing for the house. They're essentially trying to get her to cave because her legal fees are getting exorbitant. I hate edit to answer a few questions. 1. We do have a lot in our favor, but there are a lot of steps to get to trial. By the time we get there, she's going to have to spend a lot of money. Money she doesn't have. She has an eye condition, but it isn't bad enough to qualify as a defense. At the time she was driving. She's a terrible witness. Her evidence is all over the place. When she was examined, she denies being taken advantage of. Not great for our position. In Ontario, where I practice, contracts for the purchase of real estate don't have to be notarized. A witness for the plaintiff in suit, who was a co-worker of the plaintiff, testified very strongly against the company and in favor of the plaintiff. I questioned her about bias toward the plaintiff, if they knew each other well, were friends, etc. She said, no, just friendly co-workers, work friends, at best. I pinned her to it. When I got a chance to cross-examine the plaintiff, she had no choice but to burn her witness's credibility, because not only were they very close friends, but they had become sisters-in-law just a few years before. I still don't get why people want to fight small bias by destroying their credibility, but it happens more than you'd think. IANAL. So I'm curious, assuming she wasn't actually being biased, what would the proper response be? Would something like, "She is my sister-in-law, but I assure you that I am approaching this from an entirely objective standpoint," do the trick? Or is that relationship simply too close to allow her to be a reliable witness? Not a lawyer, but this story always gets me. My biological grandmother died 20 years ago of ovarian cancer. She left all her money, trusts, bonds to my grandfather to use and disperse. My grandfather remarried something like 15 years ago to my step-grandma. My grandfather ended up dying first a few years back. My step-aunt is a greedy bitch who lives on the opposite side of the country. She's lived off of her mother and my grandfather for all of her life. She'd come over and take them on vacation, where she'd use their money to buy herself things and get a free skiing trip about 8x a year. After my grandfather passed, my step-grandma had to move where her children lived to get care for dementia. My step-aunt has access to not only her own mother's estate but my grandfather's as well to take care of her needs. That wasn't enough. She decided to try and sue my dad and uncle for their dead biological mother's estate. My dad is bilaterally paralyzed and in a wheelchair. My uncle is a triple bypass survivor with a pacemaker and multiple stints. Both are on fixed disability income. The court date came and I literally wheeled my dad in while my uncle walked with a cane. My step-aunt is entirely able-bodied and rolling in the millions. My step-grandma and grandfather worked their whole lives to earn. The judge took one look at the whole picture and she was absolutely denied access to my biological grandmother's estate. We were there for less than an hour. Dog, absolutely fuck your aunt. Someone I knew had a rodeo case where she had to defend a person who had been charged with the criminal offense. Even though the police and DA could pretty much pinpoint the crime to her client, there was no evidence to tie him to the crime. Circumstantial at best. She had instructed him to shut up and let her do the talking during the trial. As from experience, the client sometimes does not know how to answer a question properly. She pleads and can show that the court has nothing on her client. She feels that for once, a rodeo case is going her way. After her plea, the judge thanks her for her plea and turns to her client.